now I'm going to be lost for words. I was going to say, the father of G20, G7 research, really. Of all global experts, John, you're the one to have, and you followed the journey of the G20 for a significant amount of time. So I guess what we're going to benefit from today is your reflection on the past and ability to look forward. But I love that you're sitting next to Emily Okabe, who is Japan's G20, Girls 20 ambassador. Emily has been involved with the Girls 20 for a year now. She was a delegate to the summit in Argentina last October, nominated as the ambassador this year, and just from our discussion earlier, a strong human rights advocate working with Human Rights Watch. So I think bringing a degree of policy coherence to her thoughts about the G20 and how it relates to other global agendas. So John, if I could ask you to speak first.
Arigatou gozaimasu. Merci. Thank you. My subject is Japan's plans and priorities for the Osaka summit. Japan has now held the presidency of the G20 for 10 days, but has not yet, it appears, seized control of the G20.org website, or if it has, it has not uploaded onto it its plans, its priority for the Osaka summit, which means the world, I guess this is a public diplomacy point, is still largely in the dark about what it plans to do, which underscores the importance, I think, of our dialogue today and the leadership of Jonathan Luckhurst and his colleagues here at Sophie University in getting a really fast start as to what we have in store. However, without the help of websites in the internet age, I think there is something that we can reliably say about what Japan's agenda and approach to the Osaka summit is, if I can manage the technology, which it appears I can. December 1st, 2018, 10 days ago, in the early afternoon, Argentina time, that was the day when Japan formally assumed the presidency, even before the previous summit in Buenos Aires had come to an end. The leaders' final session of the summit was opened, unusually, by a televised dialogue amongst the leaders, at which time Prime Minister Abe spoke in Japanese to his fellow leaders and to the media covering the event. And what he said in Japanese was a list of his priorities. And this is as best as I can decipher it into the English language. So we have not as much depth, I think, as we'd like in what lies under each of those categories. But this is what he said in turn his priorities were. And since he is the leader, and it's ultimately about leaders, and because we do know the Japanese government had been thinking about this for a long, long period of time, I think this matters a great deal. The first, promoting free trade. And that is consistent with the classic view that the G20 is an economic summit, consistent with the view that the multilateral trade system and the liberal world order it embodies is in decline under assault. That trade is key to prosperity in a globalized world. And as David Welsh alluded to, the striking transformations in Japanese trade policy. When I first looked at Japan a long time ago, it was the GATT and nothing but. And now it seems to be everything but the GATT as far as real trade liberalization is concerned. So promoting free trade, very important, very real. The second, science and technology innovation for a human-centered society, emphasizing women, youth, and people with disabilities. Rather a long phrase, maybe a lot packed in it. Science and technology is not new, nor is innovation. That went prime time at the Hangzhou Summit in China 2 years ago, 2016, providing some hope that there is an all Northeast Asian similarity of approach, a basis on which to build. Women, youth, and people with disabilities. Women and youth are somewhat boilerplate in G20 summitry of late. Although we'll come to this in the afternoon, emphasizing women. I'm of the view that the greatest success of the Buenos Aires summit was for the first time in G20 summit history, putting gender in first place as a defining overarching principle of everything else, and identifying a strategy for mainstreaming gender throughout. Not that they did, but that's what they said they were going to do. And I think that was a step above Mr. Abe's well-known Let Women Shine. So the new one is people with disabilities being given prominence to that degree. And that links into perhaps one lower down on the list, health. The third one, infrastructure for development. And at first glance, that's a follow-on. The big number one theme for the Argentinian summit was infrastructure as an asset class. And Japan has long been known for building more bridges and roads too, well, in many places. We'll quickly see that the new twist for the Japanese year, Argentina was just about infrastructure. Japan is about quality infrastructure, and there's a lot in that word. Fourth, global health, and that is really quite new as a priority plan from the beginning. The big burst of G20 summit into global health governance was under the Australian year, Brisbane 2014, but it was shocked into success by the Ebola crisis in the Congo. Ebola is still with us, but Buenos Aires seemed not to have noticed. This is a far more comprehensive, long-term approach. Fifth, climate change, including the circular economy, marine plastic pollution, biodiversity and energy. Music to Canadian ears, because that was one of the 5 themes, 5 priorities for the G7 Charlevoix summit half a year ago in Quebec. Not really a theme that went prime time at Argentina during their plan, but it's back for Japan. We'll be coming back and looking at in the afternoon more at climate change. The sixth, this is really brand new as a top tier theme for G20 summitry, aging populations, and I'm at least old enough to be the father or even the grandfather of G20 studies, so I see some synergy there. And then promoting the sustainable development goals and international development You would ask the casual observer at G7 summitry, particularly in this part of the world, who really put development prime time on the G20 agenda. It was South Korea when they hosted the fourth G20 summit, Seoul, November 2010. So if one is looking for Northeast Asian synergies, that is another one on the list. So that is what Mr. Abe said, and no members of my team were able to locate an English language translation or transcript of what he said. So that is all we know. Oops. However, yeah. What we do know is that at least a month before, the finance track of the G20 had developed under Japanese hosting a fairly detailed plan. In the G20 process, there are two major tracks. One is the Sherpa track, straight to the leaders, and that will have oversight of the Abe list. The other is the finance track, finance ministers and central bank governors. And compared to the G7, the finance track is relatively more important in the G20 because, as John Luckers reminded us at the beginning, the G20 began as an annual meeting of finance ministers and central bank governors in 1999 and governed only as that for about a decade until the American turned global financial crisis elevated it to the leaders level in the autumn of 2008. So for the finance track, global commons for shared growth, one of those lovely themes. A lovely sub-theme, an engine for shared growth, but if one's doing numbers, number one, quality infrastructure investment, guided institutionally by the infrastructure working group. And here I should note that Argentina had over a year and a half to prepare its summit, the longest of anyone. Japan only has 7 months. That's the second shortest. So they really did need a compressed, highly focused agenda. And as part of that, tried not to create new working groups, but just to use as little as possible of what they've got. Another great contrast is Argentina had a very bottom-up approach. Let's see what all these groups and the ministers' meetings generated, and then in the autumn we would see what was appropriate to go up to the leaders level. Japan's doing it largely the other way around. The presidency is saying at the beginning, this is what the leaders will do. The second on the finance track was universal health coverage as a critical finance issue. For the simple reason that if one doesn't do health care properly, accessibility, affordability, our governments will be bankrupt and the productivity of our economies will decline. The third, resilience against natural disasters, climate change by another name. Obviously, I'm putting front and center. I suspect those who worked for him in the finance track had Donald Trump in mind. We're trying to use different words to do the same thing, to get it through the American red pens in the drafting stage. A second component, safeguards. So this is the defensive agenda, if you will, whereas engines were designed to be the offensive agenda. So the fourth, debt sustainability and transparency of low-income countries. We're on the verge of another global financial crisis of a sort we've seen before, not an emerging market one, but the poorest of the poor. One of the reasons why this is happening is China's lending. Another is monetary policy and normalization. But one really does need, so the Japanese think, to see whether or not those low-income countries can actually pay back the debt. And to find that out, you need transparency about how much it is, who did you borrow it from, what are the terms and the conditions. And if you go bankrupt, are they your lenders, say China, going to write it off? Or you can going to come running to the IMF and to the G7 and say, you bail us out. A global imbalance is a multidimensional classic finance problem. Strong, sustainable, and balanced growth in the G20 speak. But imbalances are very much on Donald Trump's mind, although he has a much narrower definition. There's only one imbalance that bothers him. That's on China, current account. But he's got a second and third, one with Japan and one with Germany when he thinks about it. So this is very much dealing with global imbalances. It's inherently an issue that requires a multilateral solution or a management, hence appropriate for the G20. And of course, the defender of multilateralism, well, Japan is well positioned to do that. Next, addressing market fragmentation. One of the great successes of G20 governance is in the issue area of financial regulation and supervision. But they've done so much of it, and they've done so well that all the little bits they did don't necessarily add up. They have the most efficient overall regime, and there are many gaps. And some countries are implementing it at different rates, Basel III and all that. And some people are actually forum shopping. And who knows whether or not they'll have another forum to shop in once London leaves the European Union's rather respectable regime. So the success means they're now playing a defense on financial regulation and supervision. Oops. Then, the other hand, technological innovation under that international tax. And here it's the standard agenda, but the new is digital taxation. With so much commerce going digital, how do we tax that? Where do we tax it? And if it's going through Bitcoin, do we even know what's happening with tax? The next, financial innovation, including crypto assets, not cryptocurrencies. Only governments and central bankers say they own that, so it's crypto assets. But that is building on the very slow movement from the IMF and others to define a new regime. The global governance of fintech, if you will. What are those great new challenges, right, that everybody is grappling with? Next, implications for the development agenda. That, of course, was on Abe's list. That's classic. And here, I think we should be reminded, the G20 was created in 1999 with two distinctive foundational missions. All international institutions are. One was to promote financial stability in the wake of the Asian-turned global financial crisis of that time, 97 to 2002. Who thought Thailand could endanger us all? But the other was to make globalization work for the benefit of all. And that classically began with the development agenda, the soul of development consensus. And then a brand new one from the finance track, challenges of aging societies. Aging and policy implications. If you run out of workers, if you have to pay all the senior citizens their pensions, Where's the money going to come from? If you've got a massive fiscal surplus, Germany, you might get by. They claim they need it, and hence what some people call austerity, because that day is coming soon. Japan is, well, shall we say unique, right? But it's a big issue here. And again, if you look at the most rapidly aging G20 members in the world, you'll be more expert than I. But Japan, I don't think is, really number one, or at least Korea has a claim. So does China, right? So Northeast Asia, so there. And then aging financial inclusion. Finally, last summer, or this summer, about 6 months ago, Japan announced its ministerial meetings. And these provide, I think, an important hint about what the real agenda is, even though it's not a bottom-up process. Nonetheless, the real ministers in Japan, like the politicians who have been elected by people, and not just employees as they are in the United States. It's an interesting agenda. They're only doing half of them before the summit, but they've claimed the second half of the year before they turn it over to Saudi Arabia. I did mention they put the foreign ministers at the end. That might deserve a rethink. One of the innovations is health ministers. The first one was held by Germany, the Hamburg year, a very successful summit year. But there is a plan for health ministers to meet together with finance ministers a couple of weeks before the summit itself in southern Japan. Another one I would highlight is environment ministers meeting together with energy ministers. Ministerial meetings of environment ministers in G20 are very, very rare. More could be said about that, and it might be this afternoon when we turn to that. So my next task is, well, we do have, no, we've got down here. Put the two lists together, and these are the big themes on both Abe's and the finance track. So it really does look like a social summit, right? Rather than an economic, finance and economic, or a, well, hard security one. How successful is it going to be? Well, I have a model which will enable me to predict that. These are the 6 proven variables that have retro-dated summit success in the past. So after 13 summits, I use them to predict the summit of the next one. And time does not allow me to elaborate, but under political cohesion, yes, Abe-san is one of the most experienced G20 leaders, and unlike Merkel, no signs that he's on his way out. Team Japan seems to be behind him. He's hosted a successful G7 summit, so some reason to believe that for all those reasons, very different than Mauricio Macri, who did the last one, that it'll be a more successful summit than we saw at Buenos Aires 10 days ago. Arigatou gozaimasu.
And now I'd like to ask Emily Okami to speak.
Okay, hello everyone. Okay. So my name is Emily Okabe, and I'm here today, I guess, representing young women and youth and what we expect from the G20 presidency in Japan next year. So a little bit about myself. I consider myself as a human rights activist. I've been working and interning at the Human Rights Watch for about a year now. I'm also an aspiring lawyer, and I'm the G20 or the Girls 20 ambassador to Japan at the Global Summit in Argentina this October. And I'm also a third-year law student at Soka University here. And today I just wanted to share with you my experiences and how they have shaped my perspectives and expectations to the G20 happening next year here in Japan. And so if we can... Okay. So I wanted to first share with you a picture of that I had when I took on a trip to Southeast Asia this February. It was an independent research trip that I made in order to investigate and learn more about the labor issues and problems occurring inside ASEAN countries. And so during my trip, I went with one of my female friends, I guess, for research for the United Nations Student Association of Japan. And so once there, we went to 4 different countries: Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, and Vietnam. And then in order to really investigate and really listen to the field about what problems they were facing and what the situation was actually there. So in the Philippines, excuse us for a second.
Right. Keep thinking about all those questions you want to be asking at the end of this. And actually, John, just while Emily is looking her documents back there, her USB, can I ask you to elaborate a little bit on some of the issues that you highlighted at the end? When you look at a successful summit, and you mentioned that political convergence is a key issue, what are you talking about there?
Let me quote the G7 leaders at the summit at Houston, Texas in 1990. When people are free to choose, they choose freedom. Democracy. Or more broadly, given the diversity of the G20, a convergence on the characteristics and the values of open economies and open polities, which takes you into the realm of democracy, a hard word for some, and human rights. I famously ended my book on G20 governance with the claim that in the long run, the G7 and the G20 would become one in their convergence or complete convergence on democratic norms. I'll just end with another point, which will warm Emily's heart, I think. If you actually look at the communiques, you do find that the G20 summits increasingly affirm the value of human rights. That was core for the G7, not for the G20. They did it when Hangzhou at Hangzhou when the People's Republic of China hosted. They did it again in Argentina with Vladimir Putin and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia there too.
So it's an important agenda. And let's now go to Emily.
Okay, so sorry about that. So I'll be speaking from the perspective of youth. So this is a picture that I took in the outskirts of Manila, Philippines, in a Coca-Cola factory strike. And as you can see in the picture, all the men here, they've been on the strike for more than 5 years, and they've been trying to fight for changes in their working conditions. And as you can see in the photo, all the workers were very keen on telling us about their story and for what purpose they were fighting for. And even though it was just two college girls, they were very serious and treated us with a lot of respect. And so through hearing their stories, it was evident that their voices were not being heard, and even though they had won the court case, it was not, their voices were not amplified enough. And so, after hearing about their stories, and I felt this huge sense of powerlessness that I, and couldn't help but be frustrated that I couldn't do anything about the situation here, and all I could do was listen and be empathetic to them, or have empathy. And so that is how I began my works with policy advocacy. So as youth, it is true that we are still very inexperienced and blind to many of the realities that face our world today. But youth possess an important voice, one that is free from misconceptions and prejudice, and free from outside forces that can alter our opinions. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I was the delegate representative of Japan in the Girls 20 Global Summit held in Buenos Aires, Argentina this October. And so young people are facing incredible challenges and even life-threatening risks, which are disproportionately carried by girls and young women in many parts of the world today. And so that is why the Girls 20 has gathered delegates from around the world in order to really amplify our voices and say for what is good for all young women and female leaders of tomorrow. And so this Girls 20 was organized in order to foster the growth of future female leaders. And from this conference, what I saw were not only future female leaders, but a group of passionate individuals hungry for change and already taking tangent actions in order to make their hopes into a reality. And so rather than the output of the conference just being about developing a communique to the Girls 20 leaders, it was also about building the capacity and for us to take things back to our own countries, enable a social impact. To make sure our voices remain relevant and heard, and making faith and having faith in what you believe in, even though others may tell you otherwise. And so just a little about what we did at the conference. We actually turned in a communique to the G20 leaders, and I was actually also able to turn it into the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs before the G20 conference. And in there we talked about, I think it's also similar, the same to what the W20 were talking about, which was financial inclusion, rural inclusion, digital inclusion, and also the access to education. And from here, we really talked about the importance of STEAM education, the STEAM, also adding the A, which is the arts or the soft skills that usually people don't write down on their resumes. So in our communique, we really emphasized the importance for child care services, investment into financial, so the image of women in the media. And so, yes. So that is what we talked about in the Girls 20. So, and much of this was made because many of young women and female voices aren't being heard, in society today and in the decision-making process. But also, as I said, these people, there's so many people in the world whose voices are not being heard. And so just like us and them, there are countless individuals whose voices are not being heard. And although the United Nations has created the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 with the mission to leave no one behind, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And in thinking about how our capitalistic system or world operates, I have begun to think that maybe the natural momentum of capitalism is headed in the exact opposite direction as the ideals of the SDGs. And I know that's very contradictory, but so capitalism will always seek for the most profit without a deep understanding of the implications that the methods may have on people. And so in other words, SDGs defies the natural momentum of capitalism and tries to alter the direction in which society develops. And so therefore I believe that it is absolutely necessary for leaders and G20 leaders to place greater emphasis and value onto achieving equality and dignity. And from what I mean, to advocate for human rights is to demand that the human dignity of all people be respected, But also, what comes with that is the responsibility to not infringe on the rights of others and to support those whose rights are being abused or denied. And so that is what I believe that the G20 leaders must emphasize and realize. And so, as the Secretary General of the Japan Youth Platform for Sustainability, we are a group that gathers and amplifies the voices of youth working on attaining these SDGs in Japan, whose voices would otherwise not be heard. And we send them up to the government and advocate to government officials and also send delegates to United Nations conferences. And so what we believe that we have concluded that there is a limit to the GDP index. And so, as the powerhouses of the world, it is no doubt that these G20 leaders hold the most important role in the development of the world. However, if a country agenda is focused on only the material and economic growth, hundreds and thousands of people will remain suffering in poverty. And that is why we must look beyond GDP and measure things that are actually meaningful and that actually is able to tell us how healthy and thriving the people in a country actually are. And so GDP, I believe, is no longer a fit index to measure how well off a country is. And so there must be greater emphasis on human rights, equality, and dignity. And so here's a quick question. Does anyone know what day today is? Today is a very significant day. December 10th. Yes. Yes. So today is the exact day of the 70th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights. And as the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated in his message on Human Rights Day, December 10th, 2018, quote, "For 70 years, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been a global beacon, shining a light for dignity, equality, and well-being, and bringing hope to dark places. The rights proclaimed in the Declaration apply to everyone, no matter our race, belief, location, or other distinction of any kind." And so a phrase that my good friend once told me has stayed in my heart. She said, "If the system works for you, then you won't question the system." And I think it's true. Unless you are oppressed, you won't realize that there is anything that needs to be changed. But I also realize another thing is that if you're not part of the system, then you can't create change. And so that's why it is so important for the voices of youth to reach and even have a spot on the decision-making table, and to stand alongside global leaders in tackling the world's toughest challenges. And so to close off, as my mentor and founder of this Soka University stated, quote, "A great human revolution in just a single individual will help achieve a change in the destiny of a nation, and further will enable a change in the destiny of all humankind. Change is not to be waited on, but to be created. And I know that the youth of today is more than capable of building a future in which our children will live in." So thank you very much.
So we have time for a couple of questions. Anyone else? And we might take maybe two at one time. No? Okay, we'll come over to you, Mark. Okay, Tracy.
Hi, I'm Tracy Nichols. I'm faculty in the SIPS program. So I have a question actually about the Abe agenda that you were outlining. And I'd like actually both of you to comment on this question. I'm interested in the way you were phrasing it was Abe committing to science and technology innovation for a human-centered society. And it seems to me very familiar, very cliche for world leaders to want to deal with science and technology innovation. What I'm interested in is how does the addition of, or the condition of working within a human-centered society change that focus? And I think this is something that could also be perhaps made at the same point in terms of what you were saying about infrastructure and various of the other points, right? What are the things about focusing on a human-centered society that make these goals look different than they might otherwise?
Before you answer, Mark, if we can take your question.
Okay, yes. Yeah, I'm Mark Elder, Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. I have a question for Emily. I'm wondering to what extent your group is working on the working groups as opposed to just the summit. I mean, I remember when I was in the university, the students tended to only go to academic council, but not the committees, but the decisions were all made in the committees. So when they raise the issue, the academic council is already decided usually.
Actually, if we start on the first question, John, and then come to Emily to finish up.
It's a good question, and one would need to know more about the Japanese language and Japan to adequately answer it. As I think I suggested, Science and Technology for Innovation, aka the fourth industrial revolution, went prime time in G20 Cemetery in Hangzhou in 2016. And yes, digitalization, artificial intelligence, and all the great opportunities emphasized then with a subordinate clause for the risks. To what extent it resonated with a rather familiar story. China going to be the #1 technological power in the world. With an echo back to Japan as #1 in the 1980s. Some insecure Americans might have added was an open question. It's had a bit of a rocky fate since then. At Hamburg, the great normative breakthrough, and it bears on, I think, the second part of the question, was for the first time the main message, and if it didn't get through, that's a problem with public diplomacy, was that the economy should work for society, put people first, to put society first, right? And then one can think of, investing in technologies that put people first. I don't know, better robots to care for the elderly and infirm, part of the Japanese agenda. I guess I must say though, some people would treat it with skepticism, and when I look in that category, what are the enabling technologies for youth? Two sources of my skepticism. The one, if you want jobs of the future in the digital age, which was one of the big three priorities for Argentina this year, the best research from the OECD says that you don't get it by stuffing people down the STEM silo, science, technology. It's global awareness, right? It's the soft skills. Including the sorts of things that those of us who teach international relations here at SOCA or at U of T or Griffiths or elsewhere claim we do. The other thing, of course, and we can come back to this after, and then tech fix, we called it a long time ago. I'll pollute first and hope somebody else will come up with some formula with massive government subsidies to clean up the pollution later. Carbon sequestration and capture is how much should G20 summits endorse it? How much should the taxpayers invest in it, or other kinds of geoengineering solutions? So I must say there will be a claim, I guess you might hear this afternoon. You shouldn't put society first and then the economy serve it. You should put the ecology first, right? So I think technology has its limits, and we could see how far-reaching the climate change and natural disaster agenda of Osaka is going to be relative to the demand.
So, thank you so much for your question. Was your question focusing on the Girls 20, or was it for, the Girls 20? So we are actually an informal engagement group, meaning that in order to have more girls' voices represented, and so this year we also had delegates from Afghanistan, First Nations countries, Yukon area in Canada. We also had the African Union and yes, we had one more, but the whole point of that is so that not only the girls, or the G20 countries, but also other, delegates and girls from other countries can also be represented in having their voices amplified. And so your question was committees or
Working groups.
working groups. So
You
we
address the working groups.
we only addressed 4 areas. So digital inclusion, financial inclusion, and so we didn't technically specify working groups in the G20, and so it was more of like a holistic kind of communique towards the G20 leaders.
Sounds like that's a conversation that might evolve as well. After asking you all to think about all your fabulous questions, we have run out of time, but I know you'll have brilliant conversation over lunch. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
That's going to be difficult to follow, but we'll move on. Now we're talking about the G20 and global economic governance in session 3. I'm Nick Emanuel, Osaka, and I will be the chair of this panel. I should go in the order here, but I think I will. We have Daisuke Katagawa from the Canon Institute of Global Studies. We'll be talking on G20 macroeconomic governance and Japan's contribution. Also have Jonathan Lockers, if you know, from Osaka University as well. And he'll be talking about decentralizing global authority through G20 economic governance. And we also have Naoki Tanaka of the Center for International Public Policy Studies. And he'll be talking on business perspectives on G20 global governance. So we'll take about 10 minutes each, and then we'll open up to questions. So we'll start with Daisuke.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank Osaka University and University of Toronto and University I'm sorry, I think University. Also, the Higher School of Economics. And although I'm Japanese, I may be actually representing Russian Higher School of Economics because I know that the person who got me here was actually my friend Professor Zuyev. And since I speak Russian better than English, so I'll try it, I think, today. And I'm quite honored to be with Mr. Tanaka, who I worked for a long time under Mr. Junichiro Koizumi about 15 years ago. And we, for example, increased the stores of the high buildings in Tokyo central area as well as Midtown. Yeah. So I worked in the Ministry of Finance of the Japanese government for 35 years, and I think finished with the representative for Japan at the IMF. And I was at IMF in the spring of 2009 when actually Mr. Obama put more focus upon G20 rather than G8 because there was a reason. Lehman shock actually affected lots of European countries. So if you look at the members of G7, 4 countries are from Europe, and 3 countries, Japan and the USA and Canada, are working supporting USA, but Obama was afraid that he'll be pressed by 4 European countries, so he shifted the emphasis upon G20 rather than G7. That was spring of, I think, 2009. And maybe I think that's the reason why, as you mentioned, the compliance ratio is very, very low. Okay, then let me start with my experience. I was in charge of dealing with the financial crisis of Japan in 1997 and 1998, and with the Lehman shock in 2008 at the IMF. In the case of Japanese financial crisis, we have eliminated all cross-border transactions before liquidation of major financial institutions and prevented the impact of such liquidation from spreading out the world. In consequence, in the case of Lehman shock, the crisis spread to the whole world because cancellation of cross-border transactions was not made before liquidation of Lehman. Looking at the world, from the beginning of this century, 9/11 marked the first, I think, trigger of the invasion to Afghanistan, Iraq, by countries like the United Kingdom and the United States, and the political unrest in the Middle East, such as Libya, caused by intervention of, again, the United Kingdom, France, and the United States, with the backdrop of a prolonged recession after the Lehman shock, have created huge inflow of refugees into Europe and invited political, social, and economic instability in Europe. What happened since 1916 was a voters' revolt against the widening gap between the rich and the poor, which have brought about the collapse of traditional political forces on both sides of the Atlantic. This movement continues today. Underlying the movements is the financial capitalism which started with the abolition of the Glass-Steagall law in the United States in 1999 by my old-standing friend Summers. Whereby investment banks started large-scale high-risk transactions using deposits collected by commercial banks. When such highly leveraged business failed with Lehman, Western countries threw away the principle of so-called hard landing of financial institutions demanded to us at the time of the Asian economic crisis, and even bailed out manufacturing companies such as GM by using a huge amount of taxpayers' money. Moreover, taxpayers are frustrated because neither bankers nor administrators will pursue their responsibility. What the investment bank has done in this century is privatize profit, nationalize loss, and socialize risks. A great depression was avoided after Lehman shock, thanks to an economic stimulus in 2009 taken by each country of the scale equal to 2% of GNP in response to the call by the IMF. However, as a result of this stimulus, small countries in Europe fell into deficits and became the targets of vulture funds using such as measures as credit default swap and short sales of the government bonds. Accordingly, Europe is forced to take austerity policy, which further deteriorated national economies, including Italy. Governments should have got hold of such vulture funds first. Austerity policies further squeeze life of the low-income people. The moral hazard of financial institutions that did not take responsibility of crisis still continue now in Western countries. Quantitative easing has been introduced in order to conceal the plight of financial institutions, but the money supplied by quantitative easing caused further money under the environment of small demand for real economies. What is necessary for the world is not the financial capitalism, which makes a very small number of rich people further richer, but the development of the manufacturing industry, which increases the middle class. It is essential to dig up demands of consumers for new products, which stimulates the consumer's desire to buy them, which can be compared with the invention of such products as electric appliances and cars and so in the 20th century. In order to achieve this, we should not look at large companies that are content with uneventful life but promote venture companies which bring about new products utilizing new science and technologies. And having said that, well, this is my purely personal view, not the view of the Japanese government. I would like to propose four things. Number one, a system to separate commercial banks and investment banks, such as the Glass-Steagall, should be introduced. Number two, a new global rule should be established that in the event when financial institutions with cross-border transactions needs to be liquidated, all cross-border transactions have to be eliminated before bankruptcy, so that the failure of such financial institutions will not affect other countries. Number three, in order to create demand, in order to create real demand, as well as creating jobs, a large scale of physical stimulus, such as public works in the United States, should be introduced. Number four, in order to create new products, policies to promote ventures should be enhanced as well as introduction of rules and practice that would defend small venture companies from attacks by large companies. 1 minute, so I'd like to finish off my speech by just introducing you. That I have been regularly, visiting my friends in Southeast Asia. Among those people, like working in Ministry of Finance and also in central banks. And I'd like to ask you to get to know that central banks in Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia probably have the highest ratio of female staff in the world. They have more than 50%. And they have about, well, a little bit lower than 50% staff among people working in the Ministry of Finances in those countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to go with Tanoki Tanaka.
According to my observation, the framework of G20 will not work from this year to next year. In the case of Canadian government, they have had a lot of problems with the G20 members. One is the conflict with Saudi Arabia. Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, is a very reckless person, and Canadian government against their method for human beings, human rights in Saudi Arabia. So this is a very deep problem. And in the very near future, and in a few days ago, Canadian authority arrested Ms. Moore, who is the daughter of founders of Huawei. As you know, Huawei is a very important networkers in the period of 5G. Ericsson and Nokia and Huawei. These are the three main organizers of 5G networks. So United States are against for the Huawei's penetration into the